The sun rose over the quiet village, casting golden light across the fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where children still ran barefoot along the dusty paths, and elders sat beneath giant trees, sharing stories that had been passed from one generation to the next. The village had no tall buildings, no constant noise of engines or hurried footsteps. Instead, it thrived on simplicity, green farmlands, humble homes made of mud walls and thatched roofs, and a community bound together by familiarity. Everyone knew everyone. If a child cried at the far edge of the settlement, the sound traveled through the air, and neighbors responded as though it were their own. This was the kind of village where a man's worth wasn't measured by the clothes he wore or the car he drove, but by his honesty, his family, and the respect he earned through his deeds. From this soil rose two very different men, once childhood friends, but now walking paths that seemed to lead in opposite directions. One of them had left the village many years ago, chasing the promise of success in the big city. He was sharp, restless, and determined never to live a life of small dreams. In his mind, farming and trading in corn was too lowly, too ordinary. He wanted wealth that glittered, clothes that announced his success, and a lifestyle that separated him from the ordinary villagers. When he returned home, people often noticed the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, chin lifted, voice heavy with pride as he spoke about the modern world. To him, success wasn't just a dream, it was something he had to prove, something he wanted everyone to recognize. On the other side was his old friend, the one who had chosen to stay. He was not a man of many words, but his quiet strength was in the way he worked. Every morning before sunrise, he was already at the fields, preparing to harvest the corn that sustained his family and gave him a modest but steady income. He sold his corn by the roadside, under the shade of a small wooden stand he had built with his own hands. Some days the sun scorched his back, other days heavy rains drenched him. Yet he never complained. To him, dignity was not found in showing off, but in being content with honest work. He wore simple clothes, often patched from long use, and his hands were rough from labor. Yet when he smiled, it carried warmth, the kind that made children run toward him and elders nod approvingly. He didn't envy others, he didn't boast. His values were deeply rooted in hard work, humility, and the knowledge that wealth built with integrity lasted longer than fleeting riches. The contrast between them was like night and day. One lived for appearances while the other lived for substance. One measured life by how loudly it could be flaunted, while the other measured it by the peace it brought. And though their lives had separated, destiny was about to bring them together again, in a way that would shake the village and test the meaning of true success. When the man who had left the village finally returned, he came not quietly but with the kind of energy that drew eyes. His clothes were stylish, his shoes polished, and a watch gleamed on his wrist like a small crown of achievement. He walked through the village square with an air of superiority, expecting to be admired by those who had never left. And indeed, many villagers gathered to see him, curious about what city life had made of the boy who once ran barefoot along the same dusty paths. As he walked, his eyes caught a figure by the roadside, a figure all too familiar. There, under the shade of a small umbrella, sat his old friend. A pile of golden corn lay neatly stacked, their husks fresh, their kernels shining under the sun. Children hovered nearby, munching happily on roasted cobs the friend had prepared. The man froze, then broke into laughter, loud and mocking. "So it's true," he exclaimed, stepping closer, his voice carrying through the square. "You're still here, selling corn? After all these years? Look at you, sitting in the same place like nothing has changed. I left this village and became a man of success, while you—" He paused, gesturing toward the corn with exaggerated disdain. "You stayed behind, roasting maize for pocket change." His words stung, not only because of their sharpness, but because of the way he spoke them, dripping with arrogance as though his friend's simple life was something shameful. But the corn seller did not flinch. He lifted his eyes calmly, looked at the man with a faint smile and replied, "Yes, I am still here. I chose to stay because this is my home and this work feeds my family. It may not look like much to you, but it is honest and it keeps me at peace." The man laughed even harder, slapping his thigh. "Peace? Is that what you call it? You could have been like me, living in the city, enjoying life. Instead, you waste your days here. Tell me, what do you gain by sitting under this umbrella, selling corn like an old peasant?" The friend simply shook his head. "What I gain cannot be counted the way you count success. You see, my wealth is not in what I wear or how loudly I can speak of it. My wealth is in knowing that my hands provide, my conscience is clean, and my children do not sleep hungry." There was no anger in his tone, only quiet dignity. The villagers nearby who had gathered to witness the exchange listened closely. Some smirked, nodding in agreement with the man's ridicule. They whispered among themselves, "It's true, he has achieved more. Look at his clothes, his watch, his shoes. He is a man of the world now." Others frowned, feeling pity for the corn seller, believing his humility to be a mask for shame. But not everyone shared that view. A few of the elders, their eyes wise and weathered, muttered softly, "Do not laugh at the one who labors with honesty. Corn may look small, but it sustains life. Pride, on the other hand, feeds only the ego." The tension in the air grew heavier as the man continued to boast about his city life, the wealth he claimed to have, the connections he had made, the pleasures he enjoyed. His laughter rang through the square, each word like a spear meant to pierce the dignity of his old friend. Yet the corn seller remained calm, answering little, allowing his humility to stand against arrogance. By the end of the encounter, the villagers were divided. Some walked away shaking their heads, saying, "The man is right, the world belongs to those who chase it." Others, however, lingered by the corn stand, quietly buying more, their gestures a silent sign of respect for the one who did not bow to mockery. And so the stage was set. Two men, once friends, now stood as symbols of two very different values. Pride against humility. Wealth against integrity. The villagers waited, wondering which path life would ultimately prove right, and whose story would echo longest in their hearts. When the sun was high and children's laughter filled the air, years before arrogance and pride separated them, the two boys were inseparable. They spent their days running through the tall grass, their feet kicking up dust on the same winding paths. They shared roasted corn under the shade of mango trees, carved wooden toys from fallen branches, and dreamed aloud about the future. The bond between them was so strong that the villagers often said, "Where one is found, the other is not far behind." Yet even in those days there were signs of the different roads they would eventually walk. The boy who would later become the corn seller was grounded, with a spirit tied to the land like roots of a tree. He loved the soil, the smell of freshly plowed earth after rain, the sound of birds calling in the morning, the way corn stalks swayed gently in the breeze. While other children played endlessly, he would help his father in the fields, carrying water, planting seeds, and watching with patience as tiny green shoots pushed their way toward the sun. "The land never cheats you," he would often say even as a child. "You care for it and it cares for you." His joy was simple, but it was steady, and even then, elders nodded in approval at his wisdom beyond his years. His friend, however, saw things differently. He admired the glimmer of coins, the shine of clothes, and the allure of tales told by travelers who spoke of cities far away. Whenever a merchant passed through the village, bringing strange goods, he would be the first to ask questions, to touch fabrics, to marvel at shiny trinkets. "One day I'll leave this place," he would declare boldly. "I will not spend my life in the dirt, planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. I will go where the real wealth is, where people live like kings." His eyes burned with ambition, and though his friend laughed kindly at such proclamations, he never dismissed them. Instead he would reply, "Dream if you must, but remember, even kings eat from the land." They would argue sometimes, but always as friends. The bond they shared meant that no disagreement could keep them apart for long. Still, those early differences planted seeds that would one day grow into towering walls. One valued simplicity and honest work, while the other craved a life that glittered with recognition. Neither boy knew then that life would take them exactly where their hearts had pointed, and that the bond they once held would be tested by pride and humility. As years passed and the man returned to the village after his time in the city, the differences between them became harder to ignore. The man, filled with pride, saw his old friend not as a brother of his youth but as a symbol of failure. Whenever he passed the roadside stand, he made sure others noticed. He would speak loudly, his laughter carrying across the square. "There he is," he would say, pointing openly, "still roasting corn as though the world has not moved forward. Look at him, the same as he was when we were boys. And look at me, I left, I achieved, I made something of myself." His words stung like thorns, not only for his old friend but for the villagers who heard them. Some nodded in agreement, whispering, "Yes, he is right. The one who left has become important." They admired the polished shoes, the watch gleaming on his wrist, the way he spoke of city life as though he had conquered it. Children looked at him with wide eyes, imagining that success was measured in the shine of clothing and the boldness of laughter. But others were unsettled by his arrogance. They watched the corn seller endure quietly, never raising his voice in defense, never allowing pride to drag him into the same mud of insults. His silence spoke louder than any boast. He would smile faintly, continue roasting the corn, handing it to customers as though no mockery had been spoken at all. His calmness frustrated the man who expected anger, expected to see his words wound deeply. Instead, he saw only dignity, and that made his ridicule even sharper. "Tell me," the man would shout in the marketplace, "how much do you make in a day? Enough to buy shoes like these? Enough to travel the world like me? You waste your life under that umbrella while I live in the real world." Villagers laughed nervously, some joining in to avoid being mocked themselves. Others, however, looked at the corn seller with quiet respect. They admired the strength it took to withstand humiliation without breaking, to hold on to dignity without sinking to bitterness. The corn seller never answered with anger, only with words that revealed a different kind of strength. "Success is not in how far you go," he said once, gently handing a roasted cob to a child, "but in how true you remain to yourself. You may laugh at me now, but time reveals the truth more clearly than words." What many did not know, what the man certainly never bothered to ask, was that the corn seller's life was not as small as it appeared. His days of labor gave him more than roasted cobs to sell. Over the years, he had expanded quietly, supplying corn to other traders in nearby towns. His income, while modest in appearance, was steady and reliable. He was not burdened by debts or flashy expenses. His wealth was simple but sustainable. His family ate well every day, his children went to school, and his wife never worried about tomorrow's meal. Beyond his own household, he carried the weight of others. When a widow in the village could not afford food, he would bring her baskets of corn without asking for payment. When a child's school fees were due, he slipped coins into the teacher's hand, ensuring the child stayed in class. His generosity was quiet, without announcement or need for recognition, but the villagers noticed. They saw him helping an old man repair his roof, lending seeds to a struggling farmer, and sharing what little he had with those who had less. To them, he was not just a corn seller, he was a pillar of the community, though he never called himself one. And so, while the man laughed loudly in the square, building his image on pride and scorn, the corn seller built something far greater in silence. His true strength was not measured in the weight of gold or the shine of possessions, but in the countless lives he touched without seeking praise. Though some villagers still wavered between admiration for the man's city tales and respect for the corn seller's quiet life, the balance was beginning to shift. People started to whisper among themselves, "Who is truly rich? The one who boasts loudly, or the one whose hands give without pride?" What the man did not see, blinded by his own arrogance, was that the foundation of his image was fragile. He believed success meant rising above others, but his friend's hidden strength was proving that true success might not need to rise at all. It could simply stand firm, unshaken, while the winds of pride howled around it. The man's downfall did not come like a sudden storm, though to him it felt that way. It began slowly, quietly, with cracks in the foundation of the image he had worked so hard to project. In the city, his businesses that once seemed promising began to falter. A deal he thought was certain fell apart when a partner withdrew support. Money he had borrowed in confidence became a chain around his neck when profits failed to appear. He spent lavishly, trusting that more wealth would come tomorrow, but tomorrow came only with more debt. Friends who had once clapped him on the back, praising his success, began to vanish one by one, their loyalty tied only to the shine of his coins. The same people who had toasted him at parties, who had listened with envy when he spoke of his rise from the village, now avoided him as though misfortune were a disease. Betrayals came next. A business partner disappeared with funds he had trusted him to manage. Another spread lies to cover his own failures, leaving the man to face accusations alone. With each passing month, his savings dwindled, his debts mounted, and the proud life he had flaunted crumbled. The watch that once gleamed on his wrist was sold. The shoes that once carried him proudly through the village square became worn and scuffed. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, now drooped under the weight of humiliation. When the city no longer had space for him, he returned to the only place he knew, the village he had once mocked for being too small, too simple, too ordinary. But this time he came not as a man of success, but as a man stripped of illusions. His arrival was quiet, unlike the first time when his footsteps demanded attention. He slipped into the village with lowered eyes, hoping perhaps that people had forgotten his words, his laughter, his scorn. But villages do not forget so easily. Whispers followed him as he walked. "Is that not the same man who mocked his friend for selling corn?" an old woman asked. "Yes," another replied, "the one who thought himself above us all." Children stared at him with curiosity, remembering faintly the bold man who had once boasted so loudly. Now they saw only a shadow of that man, humbled and weary. He sought support from those he had dismissed, but doors were slow to open. Pride, once his weapon, had become his wound, and the people who had endured his arrogance remembered it too clearly. Meanwhile, life for his old friend was not the same as before. The small corn stand by the roadside had grown into something much larger. What once seemed like a humble way to survive had blossomed into a thriving business. He supplied not only the villagers but also nearby towns. Traders came to him, recognizing the quality of his harvest. With careful planning and patience, he had bought more land, expanding his fields until golden waves of corn stretched far and wide. He had invested in livestock, ensuring his family's future was secure. His home, though still modest, stood sturdier than before, a symbol not of showy wealth but of steady progress. The villagers respected him deeply, not merely for his success but for the way he carried it. He never boasted. He never mocked those who had less. Instead he shared. Children who once struggled to stay in school were now learning because he paid their fees. Families who had nothing to eat during lean seasons found baskets of corn at their doors, delivered quietly without fanfare. He was spoken of in hushed tones not because of arrogance but because of reverence. He is not just a corn seller, they said, he is a man of honor. His prosperity was not hidden but it was not flaunted. When he walked through the village, people greeted him with genuine warmth. Elders blessed him openly, proud that a man of such humility had risen without abandoning his values. His success was not loud, but it echoed in every life it touched. And so, while the man who had mocked him once returned with his head bowed, the corn seller stood taller than ever, though his spirit remained just as humble. Their paths finally crossed again one quiet afternoon. The man, weary from rejection and burdened by shame, approached the familiar roadside stand. The sight of it brought back memories, of laughter, of mockery, of pride. Now, the same umbrella that once seemed so small loomed large in his mind, a reminder of everything he had dismissed. His steps were heavy, and when he finally stood before his old friend, he could hardly lift his eyes. The corn seller looked up, and for a moment time seemed to pause. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed not by scorn or triumph but by a calm gentleness. He rose from his seat, wiping his hands on a cloth, and waited. The man struggled to speak, his throat tight with words unsaid. Finally, with a voice low and broken, he whispered, "I mocked you. I thought myself better. But here I am with nothing. I came because I need help." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of pride collapsing and humility rising. Villagers nearby pretended not to watch, though every ear was turned toward them, eager to hear what would be said. Would the corn seller laugh as he had been laughed at? Would he turn away, letting his old friend taste the bitterness of rejection? But the corn seller did neither. Instead, he placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder and said softly, "You are still my brother. Life has its ways of humbling us all. Sidi, you are welcome here." The man's eyes filled with tears he had not shed in years. The simple kindness, the absence of bitterness, cut deeper than any words of mockery ever could. Pride melted into gratitude, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of true humility. The villagers who had watched in silence now nodded to themselves. They saw in that moment that true greatness was not in wealth or words, but in the ability to forgive, to welcome without bitterness. The encounter marked a turning point not only for the two men but for the entire village. One had been humbled, the other had revealed the depth of his strength, and together they painted a lesson that would not be forgotten. Pride fades but dignity endures. The two men sat beneath the shade of the same tree where they had once played as boys, the air between them heavy with memories and unspoken truths. The man, once filled with arrogance, now found himself silent, humbled by the kindness shown to him. His old friend, the corn seller, roasted 2 fresh cobs and handed one over with a calm smile. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of forgiveness. "You see," the corn seller began softly, "life does not always reward the fastest or the loudest. It rewards those who remain steady, who work with honesty and patience. I did not stay here because I lacked dreams. I stayed because I knew the land would not betray me, because I knew that peace was worth more than gold that burns quickly in the fire of pride." His words were gentle, not condemning, but they cut through the man's heart like a blade of truth. The man lowered his head, shame and gratitude mixing within him. He thought of the years wasted in vanity, the energy spent mocking the very life that had proven stronger than his own choices. "I see it now," he murmured, voice trembling. "I thought wealth was measured in what others could see, the clothes, the watch, the house. But all of that crumbled like dust. You, on the other hand, have built something lasting, not just for yourself but for others. I mocked you for selling corn, Yet you have shown me what it truly means to be rich. His old friend nodded, not with pride but with quiet acceptance. Humility is the beginning of wisdom, he replied. It is never too late to learn. The man felt a burden lift from his heart, replaced with a new sense of humility. In that moment, forgiveness had been given, redemption had begun, and a broken bond was mended. The story of their reconciliation spread quickly through the village, carried from mouth to mouth like fire catching dry grass. Villagers gathered in small groups, speaking about what they had witnessed. Some remembered clearly the man's mocking laughter, the way he had once flaunted his city wealth. Others remembered the corn seller's quiet endurance, his refusal to let mockery poison his dignity. Now, seeing the tables turned, they reflected on the lessons with sincerity. We must never despise honest work, an elder said, his voice firm. For it is the backbone of life. Corn may seem small but it feeds us all. Pride may seem strong but it feeds nothing. Women at the well nodded, recalling how the corn seller had helped them in times of need. He never turned away a hungry child, one said. Yet he was mocked as if his work was shameful. Today we see the truth. It is better to be humble and useful than proud and empty. Young men who once admired the flashy image of city life, now reconsidered their dreams. What good is wealth, one asked aloud, if it does not last? What good is respect if it is earned only through arrogance? Their voices carried the weight of a new awareness. Even children, though too young to understand fully, sensed that something important had unfolded. They saw the man, once untouchable, now softened, and they understood that no one was too great to be humbled. The village as a whole felt changed, as though a mirror had been lifted to their faces. They saw in the corn seller's steady rise the value of patience and integrity. They saw in the man's fall the danger of arrogance and empty pride. In whispers and conversations, they passed the lesson along, ensuring that future generations would remember. Respect is not given to the loudest voice, but to the one whose deeds speak quietly yet powerfully. The story became a parable among them, told at firesides, woven into the fabric of their culture. And so, the final chapter closed not with bitterness but with peace. The two men, once divided by pride, were seen side by side once again. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and red, they sat at the roadside stand. The corn seller roasted fresh cobs, the smoke curling upward like an offering of reconciliation. He handed one to his old friend, and this time there was no mockery, no shame, only gratitude and laughter shared between them. The villagers who passed by smiled at the sight, their hearts warmed by the image of forgiveness made real. A voice seemed to rise above the scene, timeless and steady as though carried by the wind itself. True wealth is not in what you flaunt, but in what you build with integrity. Pride rises and falls, but humility endures. Gold may glitter for a while, but the glow of honest work lights the path for generations. The words lingered as if the earth itself had spoken them, sealing the lesson into the hearts of all who had seen the story unfold. The evening ended with laughter, the kind that carried no arrogance, only the comfort of brotherhood restored. The man, once so proud, tore pieces of roasted corn with his hands, eating with the same joy he had known as a boy. His friend laughed with him, not at him, and the villagers who passed by nodded knowingly. In that simple act, two men sharing corn at the roadside, the story found its perfect ending. The bond of youth was rekindled, pride was laid to rest, and humility stood tall as the true victor. And long after the fire died and the night wrapped its arms around the village, the lesson remained, echoing like a drumbeat in the hearts of all who had heard it, that life in the end honors not those who boast the loudest, but those who walk quietly with integrity, feeding others not just with food, but with dignity and love.